Toxic stress may be a phrase you've heard recently, but what is it? The notion of stress, of course, is nothing new, but we are learning more about what this kind of stress can mean to a child's health, even their genetics, their future. So what can we do about it? Stay tuned. Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 network of public media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned.
I have a good household. It's me, my father, and my uncle. We're a pretty good family. Man, my neighborhood is very bad, and my dad doesn't want me getting hurt. He wants me to go to a good school. My dreams are to make it through high school. I want to do what I can to get through high school. And I'm proud to be in school, and I keep on task because I know what my future holds.
From a young age, I never really had my mother, and my mother has been incarcerated for most of my life. I live on the south side of St. Louis. You see the same people doing the same terrible things they were doing yesterday. It is hard. I just appreciated the value they kept in their students. When I get home from school, it's homework, grants, scholarship. It's me looking at different things to make me better.
Seeing my mom struggle so much, it really hurts. You know, it was real hard because my father was never there for me. I was struggling. By the time I graduated my freshman year, I had a 2.8. When I got into my sophomore year, I had to change that to a 5 state. I have a family. When I graduate high school, I do want to go into the United States Navy. Just recently got an ASVAB book, and I've been studying on it, so hopefully I can overcome that barrier.
I guess I didn't get that many opportunities in life. It's probably fear, nervousness. I don't put myself out there sometimes. I live in a bad neighborhood and I still hear gunshots. He was just still getting killed out here. I don't know why. I don't want to be a part of it. The kids wasn't learning, the teachers wasn't teaching, so I felt like I needed to leave. I wanted to learn. I wanted to get my high school diploma.
So I was born in Mexico. We came over here a few days before I turned 2. For like the first few years that we were here, we would just move around from state to state. Honestly, I never even thought that I would get this far. Neither of my parents went to high school. My grandparents didn't go to school. This is the farthest that anybody in my family has gone. Right here. I have too many people to prove that I can be successful too. If it wasn't for them, I would not be as engaged in school as I am right now.
That was just a little slice there of Works in Progress. It's a documentary produced by the 9 Network as part of their work around American Graduate. We'll try to revisit some of that throughout the show. It really sets the table for what we're talking about here tonight, I think. Let me introduce the folks here at the table. Carter Whitson, Project Director, St. Louis Mental Health Board. John Constantino, Professor of Psychiatry and Pediatrics, Washington University School of Medicine. And Nancy Cambria, reporter, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I want to just start with something, a social media comment. I think this was on the PBS website, talking about on an article that was talking about this idea of toxic stress. And someone chimed in and said, in today's news of the obvious report, we examined the correlation between having a messed up life and a messed up childhood. People may not take this seriously, or they don't think it should be taken seriously.
Right. And I think people have this sort of sense that, you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps a lot of times, and that, but the scientific research is suggesting that a lot of issues come out from stress early on in childhood, and it has a great impact on early health, the way a child's brain develops, the way a child's early biological processes develop, so that they are primed to deal with stress during their lifetime, and that creates behavioral problems that they have to overcome. And then sadly, the research is showing that children who are exposed to too much stress and who aren't given some resilience or ways or relationship to alleviate that stress in their lives, it can go on to impact their future health as adults.
A lot, so that's a lot to unpack.
Right.
I guess maybe let me ask the question first. So my day job at KSDK, News Channel 5, is doing a program, Alive and Well STL. And Nancy, you've done some amazing reporting that was very well received in social media around the area. Why are we hearing about this now?
Well, I think the research has been around for a long time, but I think it's finally coalescing. And I think more and more people are looking at early trauma in childhood and making connections that stress from poverty and other issues causes a lot of trauma in children. And it's starting to really, all the research is starting to snowball. So the most recent stuff that we're looking at is epigenetics. That's how stress actually affects the turning on and off of genes in the DNA of children. And there's now research right based out of St. Louis looking at what toxic amount of stress on a child can do to their brain development in terms of brain volume in critical areas of the brain where they work on behavior, where they're able to process fear. Those brain volumes are significantly smaller. So there's really devastating looks that research is starting to show, but also there's research showing that there's ways to prevent that from happening.
So first, tell me what we mean when we say toxic stress.
Well, that's a great question, Casey, and I think it's a very important one to think about where to draw the line, because we've known, as Nancy was alluding to, that for a century, from experiments and the follow-up of children that were truly deprived and had very serious kinds of deprivation, that their outcomes were grossly abnormal. And so the question is, how far short of a complete psychosocial deprivation, maybe rearing a child, in a Eastern European orphanage where they have, no caregiving, no touch, no, just some food and not any kind of reasonable, the worst case scenario. And we've known for a century what that does. So the question is there a subtler version of that does the same sort of damage? And it's no surprise, as Nancy's alluding to, that yes, it does. The question is, how does it do that? And are there really smart, strategic ways to offset those kinds of risks for children, who are liable to go through that? And I think one of the issues one of the ways to think about toxic stress is to think about how much stress for an individual child, and it varies for different children, is enough to overwhelm that child's coping mechanism, the way in which that child's brain and body manages those kinds of environmental stimuli. And once you cross that threshold, then what happens is rather than stress building you up, making you stronger, it starts to break you down in various ways. And people are studying this and finding the traces of that. So figuring out which children can tolerate which stressors and how to protect the ones that are most liable to those stressors, I think are really an important frontier for helping children who are at these kinds of risks.
Let's go back to works in progress real quick. Let's meet Leon once again, speaking of the children that this affects.
I live in a bad neighborhood. I still hear gunshots. If I ever want to go to my mom's house, she said don't come because it's so many shootings over there. I don't want to be a part of that.
We don't know what we can do for each individual as a community, and developing public policy to address all of the various factors that contribute to the unrelenting stress that people in poor neighborhoods face, people with dysfunctional families, people who have been isolated from the rest of the community. Trying to build a system of care for people in those conditions is tough. And it's as tough as bringing St. Louis City and St. Louis County together. So.
And Leon, even just this little snippet about Leon is illustrative of one of the cruelest effects of all of this. So going back to the old early deprivation experiences, Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, discovered that in the context of wartime, if children were separated from their parents in order to protect them from the ravages of war, their outcomes were actually worse than if they huddled with their own parents in the bomb shelters. And here Leon one of the cruelest effects of the neighborhood and the poverty that he's in is that the end result of it is to be separated from his mother.
His mother
says,
Right.
"Stay away.
Don't come over.
Don't
my
come
house."
over here," when he wants to come see her. You know,
Right.
and I think this is really a cruel, a representation of the cruelty of poverty. That in many ways, when it not only, you know, diminishes opportunity, but when it robs a child to reach his own or her own genetic drive or evolutionary potential to just do what's the right compensatory thing, you know, to salvage yourself, that's when it really becomes overwhelming. And for many children, that's how it is.
I think a lot of people may have been surprised to hear, at least I was, the genetic component that you wrote about.
Right. Right. And I think that's the new research is coming to that way. And, you know, the question is, how do you prevent those genes that should be turned off from being turned on? And a lot of it has to do with relationships. So that key relationship with Leon's mother for early childhood, from the birth to age 3, the children are developing in a snap of a finger 700 neurons per second in their brain. Okay, so that's the whole information superhighway in your brain. The thing is, it doesn't develop on its own in a vacuum. It develops through positive relationships with mom, dad, caregivers, language, lullabies. So those things are happening early on, and if a baby doesn't get that kind of attention, if mom or dad are too stressed, or there are other factors going on, or there's an absence of attention, that causes stress. And those stress hormones, the neural connections start to develop to deal with stress versus positive relationships. And then genetically, the same type of stress hormones, and they're even finding some instance of this crossing over in the womb before birth, is turning on and off different types of genes. And one of the ones that was most striking to me, and I think just disturbing, is that children still in the womb, a fetus, developing fetus, is having a gene, I can't remember if it's turned on or off, and that's my lack of science.
You're doing fine.
They're priming for stress, thank you. It's a gene that would help the baby or a child moderate stress.
They're coming
And
out
yet
of the womb at a disadvantage?
They're coming out of the womb primed to deal with stress versus, you know, they're more stressed. Yeah.
Well, and Carter's work, I think, represents another angle on genetics, Casey, which is that, you know, if you consider that a majority of the influence on mental illness is conferred by genetic factors, not all of it, but truly a majority of what we know of what causes mental illness, and having that kind of liability is influenced very strongly by genetic factors. You can imagine a child who has inherited a genetic liability for an adverse life outcome like a mental illness. When you compound that with, you know, these unimaginable levels of stress that are continuing to sort of compromise their system, compromise their ability to adapt, those are individuals who are born, in a sense, with an inherited liability that makes these kind of life experiences even harder on them. You know, let alone just the direct effects of a stressor on these, you know, genetic modifiers of how a person handles stress and experience. There are children who are born with these kind of liabilities, and really, if they were protected, they would have much better outcomes. But if they're not protected, they're liable on the basis of these same factors that we've known about for a very long time.
And is it always in situations like Leon's where bullets are involved and you can unfortunately make that war analogy, or is this beyond?
I got a better one for you.
Well, this is the point, that it depends on the child. For one child, some children are literally bulletproof. They are so resilient. You know, I mean, I just heard the story the other day of Pope John Paul II. Okay, read the story about how this man grew up. Okay, the guy was bulletproof as far as stressors were concerned. But you put that same level of stress, or even a very modest level of stress, on another child who's vulnerable in a certain way that we still can't specify. Right. I mean, some of these things have been worked out in, you know, very focused experiments, but we're still trying to figure out how to identify a child that cannot tolerate this level of stress without having this particular really rough outcome. And so, I think, Carter, you know.
One of the things that we're learning is that toxic stress is generational as well. So it's sort of like crack babies. You know, your mom is stressed, so you're going to be born with a certain amount of stress already when you come out of the womb. So what we need to probably do is stop looking at these things as isolated diseases or isolated concerns when they're all part and parcel of the same thing of growing up and being social animals. Because when you don't have connections with your child growing up, and your neurons develop, that's when you're learning how to be a social animal.
Yeah.
And when you say you're born with stress, that has implications on how you sit in class, how
Yes.
you, on your physical health. You tell me.
Well, and I think to take the cocaine analogy, which was an excellent analogy, you know, if it was learned very early on that if a child who was born exposed in utero to cocaine was immediately after birth adopted into a supportive home environment, it dramatically reduced the association between the status of being cocaine exposed in utero and having a bad outcome. So the first buffer was the fact that that having a caring, supportive, loving environment in the adoption sense, as opposed to an environment that might be associated by staying in the household of somebody who was, you know, using cocaine while you were in utero, those are two different, you know, completely different worlds. And so I think there are many opportunities to buffer stress. The Chicago project on crime in Chicago neighborhoods 2 decades ago was very instructive on this. And it showed that from the standpoint of crime and delinquency, that whereas crime and delinquency were historically, always have been, associated with poverty at some level, that poverty raises risk for crime and delinquency, that essentially you could wipe out the effect of poverty if you controlled for essentially family factors. That essentially it was family factors that were associated with poverty that were the real culprit in raising that liability to those outcomes. And so I think in some ways we have to be very careful about this idea of, okay, poverty automatically causes these stressors, automatically has this sort of fatalistic, you know, idea that a child can't survive that. I mean, I don't like poverty any better than the next guy, but concentrated poverty, where all of these factors are coming together, in a situation where there are no buffers, as Nancy was saying, is a recipe, you know, for a disaster. And even little kids start to show signs when too much is too much. And that's when we have to really come in and recognize that we have to do the job of rescuing them and their families from that level that's toxic to them.
And there are evidence-based programs that show parents how to parent well. And we know that parental influence is a great mediator in children coping with toxic stress and becoming more resilient as they grow up.
So can a child suffer toxic stress without poverty in the equation?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, poverty is just I think poverty is just a marker. I mean, imagine the scenario of a family who is trying to support a young child's development where the chaos of the neighborhood, the lack of access to resources, difficulty with transportation, just the slings and arrows of life that heap up are constantly barraging them. And so that's one situation where that can happen, but you can get barraged in many other life circumstances, rich or poor, you know, any part of town that can happen.
We were just talking about the heroin problem that is really now taken hold here, and that you could probably go down into a cul-de-sac into a middle-class neighborhood and find a household that's dealing with an addiction issue in their household, and that's going to throw the entire household into tumult. And if they isolate themselves from community and family because of various issues with that addiction, that's going to increase their stress. Don't forget there's probably other children in the household as well, so that stress is trickling down to them. The parents may not be able to deal with the child because they're dealing with another child with an addiction at the time. So yeah, it could be anywhere.
We may have unfortunately we have an example of what you're talking about with drug abuse. Let's hear some more from Breann from Works in Progress.
My mom used to be an addict. She overdosed on pills. That's how she passed. He warned me, and he warned me around the tree branch, and he warned me over and over. kept telling me that your mother is not going to stop until she kills someone or kills herself. Me and my father were sitting in the car, and there's a song that came on that reminded us both about my mother. And we just sat there and we talked about her, and we talked about how good she was. My mother was a great mother. She wasn't a deadbeat. It's a picture of her, and I always sit in front of the picture, and I pray with her every night and every morning.
What does the research say about the prospects of making up what is lost in the childhood? Can the damage of toxic stress, what are the odds of overcoming that later in life?
Well, in many ways it's related to, is there a surrogate? Is there a substitute? Is there somebody that provides you the mechanism, as Carter was saying, to compensate, to be resilient, and to get out of that? And children look for that. I don't know what Breann was, what the situation was with the doll and the
I think I think that's a doll from one of the classes at school where you have it records the way you take care of it.
Yeah. Well, there's something symbolic about that scene because in many cases, children's immediate reaction to a situation, and I have seen, scores of cases where children are in his situation, where mom or dad are succumbing to a drug abuse problem and on the road to self-destruction in that way. And what's their reaction? Is they take care of one another. They huddle. They find each other. I mean, the survivors find each other. And this kind of, almost symbolic representation of him doing that with this, this particular exercise for him, this is what children do. They seek that. And they're in a way, as much as we talk about, the genetics and epigenetics of damage done, children have an evolutionary and a genetic drive to do what's going to help them and salvage them. And sometimes poverty just robs you of the necessary ingredients that you would otherwise find if they were there to help, rise and to overcome and master. And again, I've seen this so many times where children will find one another, support one another, siblings will find and support one another, and in that they find, solace and resilience and transcendence really over the problem.
This is a comment you'll read in the comments section of Nancy's story, and then on Facebook and Twitter and other places, people will say it's kind of that bootstrap mentality. This is someone who weighed in here, Karen, saying it's mostly about taking responsibility for yourself instead of looking to blame society for your ills. Is this?
That's harsh.
Yeah, I know. I'm tired of this bootstrap analogy. It's hard to raise yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't have any boots. And when people are faced with unrelenting stress, with unrelenting daily problems that affect their functionality, that's like having somebody taking your boots away and you don't even have socks to keep you warm. Yeah. So let's change that talking about rising up from bootstraps. Let's talk about what we can do to help our neighbors, because that's basically what it boils down to.
The families that we followed for 7 months, there were some really dire times for the families, but there were incredible moments of grit and grace and surviving that I would really
joy.
And you would find moments of absolute joy in the house. So I mean, this kind of notion that this is just all on them, I saw incredible grit. And one woman particularly, Darlene, we wrote about the cycle of stress. She was born into a traumatic childhood. Her life had not gone so easily for her, and she worried deeply about her youngest children being born back into that stress, and she was trying so hard to make changes for them.
And you know, Casey, I mean, I love it when people champion the human spirit and say, you know, we're free. You know, we're designed that we can transcend, we can, you know, choose. But the problem is that especially for children, human beings that are still in development,
or the womb,
or the womb for that matter, if the forces weighing against that are so overwhelming that they take away the usual constructive climb, you know, and it's sometimes true that, you know, people who have had the experience and have had the capability of pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, they you know, these are survivors. These are great examples of, and people that have a lot to teach us, but they've never necessarily walked that mile where they didn't have all that equipment, or they were robbed. You know, they assume having certain equipment that not everybody has to be able to do that. And I think that's when it really becomes difficult.
In the honor of spring training starting, sometimes we think we've hit a triple in life.
right.
We were born on third base.
Exactly. Yeah.
We have less than a minute. Time has flown by, but what else can we? What should we be doing as a community?
Well, I think there's a couple of areas. I think we need to be educating various communities about toxic stress, and that there are ways that even when you can't change your particular situation, there are things you can do internally to lessen your stress. So there's some wellness, and there's also connections. I mean, investing in programs that
work.
lessen that work,
That's
lessen
Mental
that
Health Board's
isolation.
tagline.
Yeah, lessen that isolation. Give children a sense of hope.
We'll have to leave it there. We're running out of time. And I want to say, if you want to see more of the stories we highlighted tonight from the Works in Progress, Friday, March 11th, 7 p.m. here on the 9 Network. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.